The wind howled like a wild beast across the Dakota Territory that December night in 1882. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. It was the kind of weather that killed people, the kind that made even the toughest cowboys think twice about leaving their warm cabins. Jake Morrison pulled his coat tighter as he rode his horse along the fence line of his small ranch. His breath came out in white puffs that froze before they could drift away. The cold bit through his leather gloves and made his fingers ache. His horse's hooves crunched through the snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the hour. Jake had been checking his cattle all day. Winter was always hard on the animals, but this storm was something else entirely. The weather had turned mean fast, faster than anyone expected. Just that morning, the sky had been clear and blue. Now it looked like the world was ending. His ranch sat in what most folks called no man's land. It was right between the white settlements and the hunting grounds used by the local tribes. This made Jake's neighbors nervous. They thought he was crazy for building his home so far from town, so far from help if trouble came calling. But Jake liked the solitude. He liked the way the land stretched out endless in every direction. The truth was, Jake didn't have much choice about where to build. When he came west after his wife died, he didn't have much money. This land was cheap because nobody else wanted it. Too dangerous, they said, too isolated. But Jake saw something different. He saw a possibility. He saw a place where a man could start over. As he rode through the storm, Jake thought about the warnings people had given him. Old-timers in town loved to tell stories about what happened to settlers who got too comfortable near tribal land. They talked about raids and attacks, about families who disappeared in the night. Jake had heard these stories 100 times. But he'd also noticed something the storytellers always left out. Most of the trouble started when white folks broke promises or took land that wasn't theirs to take. Jake tried to be different. He respected the boundaries. He didn't hunt in areas where he knew the tribes gathered food. When he found arrowheads or other artifacts on his land, he left them alone. It seemed like common sense to him, but apparently common sense wasn't all. The snow was getting worse. Jake's horse was struggling to move through the drifts. Each step took more effort than the last. The animal's breath came out in great clouds of steam, and ice was forming on its whiskers. Jake knew he should head back to the cabin soon. This wasn't weather to be caught in. That's when he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, maybe 50 yards ahead, a dark shape was moving through the snow. At first, Jake thought it might be one of his cattle that had wandered off, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. Someone was out there in this deadly storm, stumbling through the snow with no horse, no proper winter gear. Jake urged his horse forward, fighting against the wind and snow. The figure ahead was moving slowly, desperately. Every few steps, the person would stumble and nearly fall. It was clear they were in serious trouble. As Jake got closer, he could see it was an older man. His clothes were completely wrong for this kind of weather. He wore a thin jacket and old boots that were already soaked through. Ice hung from his hair and eyebrows. His lips looked blue even in the dim light. This man was dying of cold, and he probably didn't have much time left. Jake didn't hesitate. He jumped down from his horse and grabbed the man before he could collapse completely. The stranger was barely conscious. His whole body was shaking so hard he could barely stand. When he tried to speak, only mumbled words came out. Looking at the man's features and clothing, Jake realized he was Native American. For just a moment, Jake felt a flicker of the fear that had been drilled into him by all those stories in town. This could be a trap. This could be the start of something bad. Maybe he should just ride away and pretend he never saw anything, but the moment passed quickly. This wasn't a warrior or a threat. This was just an old man who was going to freeze to death if someone didn't help him. Jake had been raised better than to leave another human being to die in the snow, no matter who they were or where they came from. Jake wrapped his own coat around the shivering man and helped him up onto the horse. The stranger could barely hold on, so Jake had to walk alongside, supporting him with one hand while leading the horse with the other. The wind seemed to get stronger with every step, as if nature itself was trying to stop them from reaching. Safety. The walk back to Jake's cabin felt like it took hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. By the time they reached the small building, both men were covered in snow and ice. Jake's hands were so numb he could barely work the door latch. The stranger had stopped shivering, which Jake knew was a very bad sign. When people got too cold, their bodies just gave up trying to stay warm. Jake's cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. It was small and simple, built from logs he'd cut himself. But inside it was warm and dry. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The main room served as kitchen, living room, and dining room all in one. A small bedroom and storage area completed the modest home. Jake helped the stranger inside and immediately went to work building up the fire. He threw on more logs until the flames roared high and hot. Then he grabbed every blanket he owned and wrapped them around the old man, who was now sitting as close to the fire as possible without actually being in it. The stranger's condition was worse than Jake had thought. His fingers and toes looked dangerously white, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. Jake had seen frostbite before, and he knew this man was in real danger of losing parts of his hands and feet. If they didn't warm up properly, Jake heated water on his stove and carefully began warming the man's extremities. He'd learned this technique from an old trapper who said the key was to warm frostbitten areas slowly and gently. Too much heat too fast could cause more damage than the cold itself. As Jake worked, he studied the stranger's face. The man looked to be in his 60s or 70s, with weathered skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. His hair was long and gray, braided in a traditional style. Even unconscious and nearly frozen, there was something dignified about him, something that suggested this was a person of importance among his people. Jake made coffee and heated up some beef stew he'd prepared earlier. The smell filled the small cabin, mixing with the smoke from the fire and the wet wool smell of drying clothes. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, warmth was slowly returning to both men. As the stranger began to recover, Jake couldn't help but wonder how this night might change everything. He was harboring a tribal member in his home during a time when tensions were high. If anyone from town found out, there could be serious consequences. But looking at the old man's peaceful face as he slept by the fire, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were more important than politics or fear. Sometimes being human was the only thing that mattered. The first thing Jake noticed when the old man woke up was his eyes. They were sharp and intelligent, like someone who had seen a lot of life and learned from all of it. The stranger blinked slowly, taking in his surroundings. For a moment, confusion crossed his weathered face as he tried to remember how he'd gotten there. Jake was sitting at his small wooden table, sipping coffee and watching the fire. When he saw the man was awake, he stood up slowly, not wanting to startle him. The old man's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, probably looking for a weapon that wasn't there. Then his eyes met Jake's, and something passed between them. A recognition that they were both just men trying to survive in a harsh world. "You're safe," Jake said quietly. "The storm's still going strong outside, but you're warm now." The stranger tried to sit up straighter, wincing as feeling returned to his hands and feet. Jake could see the pain in his expression, but also something else. Pride. This was clearly a man who wasn't used to needing help from anyone, especially not from a white settler. Jake poured another cup of coffee and held it out. The old man hesitated for a moment, then accepted it with a slight nod. His hands shook a little as he brought the cup to his lips, but whether from the cold or from emotion, Jake couldn't tell. "My name's Jake," the cowboy said, settling back into his chair. "Jake Morrison, this is my place." The stranger sipped his coffee and seemed to be thinking about how much to reveal. After a long moment, he spoke. His English was careful but clear, with the accent of someone who had learned the language later in life. "I'm called White Eagle," he said. "I became lost in the storm." Jake nodded. He didn't push for more information. In his experience, people shared what they wanted to share when they were ready. Instead, he got up and ladled some stew into a bowl. The old man ate slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm as his body remembered how hungry it was. As White Eagle ate, Jake found himself studying the man's clothes and belongings. Even wet and bedraggled, there was quality in the workmanship. The beadwork on his shirt was intricate and beautiful. His boots, though soaked through, were well made. This wasn't just any tribal member. This was someone important. "You were far from your people," Jake observed gently. White Eagle set down his spoon and looked into the fire. "I was hunting with my grandson and his friends. We were tracking an elk for 3 days. I am old, but I can still read signs better than young men who think they know everything." A slight smile crossed his face as he said this, and Jake found himself smiling too. He'd known plenty of young cowboys who thought they knew everything about ranching until the land taught them otherwise. "The storm came fast," White Eagle continued. "Faster than any of us expected. We separated to find shelter. I told them to meet at the old pine grove by the creek, but the snow became too thick. I could not find my way." Jake refilled the man's coffee cup. "How long were you walking?" "Since yesterday morning." White Eagle's voice carried no complaint. "Just fact. I knew I was lost, but I kept moving. When you stop moving in cold like this, you die." The simple truth of it hung in the air between them. Jake realized just how close this man had come to freezing to death. Another hour, maybe 2, and it would have been too late. "Your grandson must be worried," Jake said. White Eagle's expression grew troubled. "He is probably searching for me. But in this storm," he gestured toward the window where wind still howled and snow continued to fall. "I pray he had sense enough to find shelter." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Jake added another log to the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. The warm light flickered across both their faces, highlighting the lines that years of outdoor living had carved there. "You have been alone here long?" White Eagle asked, looking around the modest cabin. 3 years, Jake replied. "Came west after my wife died. Needed to start somewhere new." White Eagle nodded with understanding. The land helps heal some wounds. But it is hard to be alone. There was wisdom in the old man's voice that made Jake look at him more carefully. This wasn't just casual conversation. White Eagle was someone who understood loss and loneliness on a deep level. "You have family?" Jake asked. White Eagle's face softened. "Many grandchildren. They keep me busy with their questions and their energy. My daughter worries I am too old for long hunting trips, but a man must feel useful." Jake understood that feeling completely. After his wife died, well-meaning friends had suggested he settle into town life, maybe work in a store or an office. But Jake needed to work with his hands, needed to feel like he was building something meaningful. "What do you grow here?" White Eagle asked, gesturing toward what would be fields under all that snow. "Wheat mostly, some corn. I've got about 30 head of cattle. It's not much, but it's mine." White Eagle seemed to consider this. "The land here is good. My people hunted in this valley for many generations. The soil is rich and the grass grows thick in summer." Jake felt a moment of uncertainty. Was the old man saying he shouldn't be here? That this land belonged to someone else? But White Eagle's tone held no accusation, just observation. "I try to be respectful," Jake said carefully. "I don't hunt in the sacred places and I don't take more than I need." White Eagle studied him for a long moment. "You know about the sacred places?" "Old Pete at the trading post told me. Said there were certain groves and rock formations I should stay away from." Seemed like good advice. A look of surprise crossed White Eagle's face. "Old Pete told you this? You know him?" "Yes. He is, how do you say, an unusual white man. He has traded with my people for many years. He understands our ways better than most." Jake felt relieved. Apparently he'd been getting good advice from Pete, though he'd never been entirely sure if the old trader was just being cautious or if he really understood tribal customs. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse. Wind rattled the windows and snow piled higher against the door. Both men could hear trees creaking and occasionally crashing in the distance. This was definitely not a night to be caught outside. "Your grandson," Jake said. "What's his name?" "Running." "Wolf. He is 19, and he thinks he knows everything about hunting and tracking, like all young men. White Eagle smiled fondly. But he is brave and smart. If anyone can survive this storm, it is him. Jake could hear the love in the old man's voice, and it reminded him of how his own grandfather used to talk about him. There was something universal about the relationship between old and young. The way experience worried about enthusiasm. As the night wore on, the two men found themselves sharing more stories. White Eagle told Jake about the changes he'd seen in the territory over his lifetime, how the great herds of buffalo had dwindled and how more settlers arrived each year. Jake talked about his dreams for his ranch, his hopes of maybe starting a small community where people could work together. Regardless of their backgrounds, neither man mentioned the tensions between their peoples directly, but it hung in the air. Like smoke from the fire, they both knew this moment was unusual, maybe even dangerous. A white settler and a tribal elder sharing warmth and food while a storm raged outside. In different circumstances, they might have been enemies. But here, in this small cabin with the fire crackling and the coffee warm, they were just two human beings grateful for shelter and company. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside, something was building that would change both their lives forever. Jake woke to an eerie silence. After hours of howling wind and rattling windows, the sudden quiet felt almost unnatural. Gray morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of his cabin. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. He sat up in his chair where he dozed off, his neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was getting cold. Jake quietly added fresh logs, trying not to wake White Eagle, who was still sleeping soundly wrapped in blankets near the fireplace. As Jake moved around the cabin preparing coffee, he couldn't help but think about what this morning would bring. The storm was over, which meant White Eagle would want to return to his people. Jake felt an unexpected sadness at the thought. In just one night, he'd grown to appreciate the old man's company more than he'd expected. The coffee was just starting to boil when Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. Horses. Many horses. The sound of hooves in snow was unmistakable, even muffled by the deep drifts outside. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but then he stopped. If this was trouble, one gun wouldn't make much difference against multiple riders. White Eagle's eyes opened immediately, as if some internal alarm had awakened him. The old man sat up slowly, listening to the sounds outside with the intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading danger in the wilderness. How many? White Eagle asked quietly. Jake moved carefully to the window and peered through a gap. In the frost, what he saw made his heart nearly stop. The entire area around his cabin was surrounded by mounted warriors. They sat perfectly still on their horses, like statues carved from the morning mist. Jake counted quickly, 20, 30. Maybe more. It was hard to tell exactly because they seemed to blend into the landscape itself. A lot, Jake whispered back, maybe 40 or 50. But something was strange about the scene outside. The warriors weren't preparing for an attack. They weren't moving toward the cabin or positioning themselves for battle. They were just waiting, watching. Their horses stood calm and patient, breath steaming in the cold air. White Eagle rose slowly from his makeshift bed and joined Jake at the window. When he saw the assembled warriors, his reaction wasn't fear or surprise. Instead, something that looked almost like amusement crossed his weathered face. "My grandson," he said with what sounded like pride mixed with exasperation. "I told you." He was smart. Jake stared at the old man. "Your grandson did this?" White Eagle moved away from the window and began putting on his boots, which had dried by the fire overnight. Running Wolf has always been protective of his grandfather. When the storm hit and we were separated, he would not have simply waited for me to return. "But how did they know you were here?" White Eagle pointed toward the chimney. "Last night, when I felt strong enough, I used the old ways to send a message. Smoke signals work even in a storm if you know how to read them." Jake felt his knees go weak. "You sent smoke signals?" "From my chimney, all night?" "Only small ones." Enough to tell my people I was safe and where I could be found. I did not want them to worry or to do something foolish looking for me. The full implications of this hit Jake like a physical blow. Those warriors outside had been gathering all night while he slept peacefully in his chair. They could have surrounded the cabin hours ago. They could have done anything they wanted. Why didn't you tell me? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice. Steady, White Eagle looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Would you have stopped me? Jake opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He honestly didn't know what he would have done. The practical part of his brain said he should have been terrified. The human part of him understood that White Eagle had been worried about his family. Just as Jake would have been in the same situation, what happens now? Jake asked. Now I go outside and tell them what kind of man you are. White Eagle replied simply. Before Jake could protest or ask more questions, White Eagle was moving toward the door. The old man paused with his hand on the latch and looked back. Jake. Morrison, he said formally. Last night you saved the life of a stranger, you shared your fire, your food, your shelter. You asked for nothing in return. This is the mark of a man with honor. With that, White Eagle opened the door and stepped outside into the snow. Jake watched through the window as the old man walked slowly toward the nearest group of warriors. Even from a distance, Jake could see the respect in their postures as White Eagle approached. Several of the younger men dismounted immediately, and one, who must have been running, Wolf, rushed forward to embrace his grandfather. The conversation that followed was in a language Jake didn't understand, but he could read the emotions. Clearly enough, relief, joy, concern, and then something else. The warriors kept looking toward the cabin, and Jake realized White Eagle was telling them about the night before. As the story unfolded, Jake watched the warriors' body language change. The tension that had been present when they first arrived began to fade. Some of the men nodded approvingly. Others smiled. A few looked directly at the cabin with what Jake could only describe as curiosity rather than hostility. Then something happened that Jake would never forget for the rest of his life. White Eagle raised his voice so it would carry across the snowy landscape. He spoke in English now, clearly intending for Jake to hear every word. This man, White Eagle called out, gesturing toward the cabin, showed kindness to an enemy when he could have shown fear. He gave warmth to a stranger when he could have given suspicion. He chose to see another human being in need rather than a threat to be avoided. The old man paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Let it be known among all our people that Jake Morrison is a friend to White Eagle. Let it be known that his kindness will not be forgotten. Let it be known that any who would harm this man or his property will answer to me. A murmur went through the assembled warriors. Jake didn't need to understand their language to recognize the significance of what had just happened. This wasn't just a personal thank you. This was some kind of formal declaration. Running Wolf, a young man with the confident bearing of a natural leader, stepped forward and spoke briefly to his grandfather. White Eagle nodded and replied, gesturing again toward the cabin. Then, running, Wolf walked slowly toward Jake's door. Jake's heart pounded as the young warrior approached. This could still go wrong in so many ways. But when Running Wolf reached the door, he didn't burst in or make demands. Instead, he knocked politely and waited. Jake opened the door to find himself face to face with a man probably 10 years younger than himself. Running Wolf had his grandfather's intelligent eyes, but where White Eagle's gaze held the wisdom of age, Running Wolf's burned with the intensity of youth. Jake Morrison, Running Wolf said in careful English. My grandfather says, you are a good man. He says you saved his life. Anyone would have done the same thing, Jake replied. Though he wasn't entirely sure that was true, Running Wolf studied Jake's face carefully, as if trying to read his character in his features. After a moment, the young warrior smiled. My grandfather is a wise man, but he is also a proud one. For him to accept help from a stranger means that stranger showed true kindness. For him to speak of you as he just did means you have earned something very rare. What's that? The protection of White Eagle's family. All of our family. There are many bands represented here today. Word traveled fast about a missing elder. We came prepared for war if necessary. Instead, we found something much better. Jake looked past Running Wolf at the assembled warriors. Now that the tension had broken, some of them were dismounting and talking quietly among themselves. A few were even smiling and pointing at the cabin, apparently discussing the story White Eagle had told them. "How many are out there?" Jake asked. Running Wolf glanced back at his companions. "Nearly 200. Warriors from 12 different bands. When word spread that White Eagle was missing, old alliances were remembered. Men who hadn't ridden together in years came to help search for him. 200 warriors." Jake felt dizzy thinking about it. If things had gone differently, if he had turned White Eagle away, or if the old man had died in the storm, those 200 warriors might have come seeking revenge instead of offering gratitude. "Jake Morrison," Running Wolf continued, "my grandfather, wishes to know if you would join us for a meal before we begin our journey home. It would be an honor to share food with the man who saved White Eagle's life." Jake looked out at the sea of faces watching his cabin. Some were young, some old. Some looked curious, others respectful. All of them were waiting to see what he would do. He thought about the stories people told in town about tribal raids and attacks. He thought about the fear that kept most settlers huddled close to civilization. Then he looked at Running Wolf's earnest face and remembered the dignity and wisdom he'd seen in White Eagle. "It would be my honor," Jake said finally, as he stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Jake realized his life had just changed forever. The lonely cowboy who had gone to sleep the night before no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had somehow bridged two worlds with nothing more than basic human decency. The meal that morning changed everything Jake thought he knew about the world. The warriors had built several small fires in the snow around his property, and the smell of cooking meat filled the cold air. Jake found himself sitting in a circle with White Eagle, Running Wolf, and several other tribal leaders, sharing food and stories as if this kind of gathering happened every day. The food was simple but delicious. Dried meat, corn cakes, and a thick soup that warmed Jake from the inside out. More importantly, though, was the conversation. These weren't the savage raiders that people in town talked about in hushed, fearful voices. These were men with families, concerns, and dreams just like his own. One of the older warriors, a man named Gray Bear, spoke decent English and served as translator when needed. Through him, Jake learned that White Eagle wasn't just any elder. He was a medicine man whose wisdom was sought by tribes across the entire Dakota Territory. His knowledge of healing, weather patterns, and tribal law made him invaluable to his people. "When White Eagle speaks," Gray Bear explained, "people listen. What he said about you this morning will travel to every campfire in the territory within a moon's time." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What exactly did he say?" Gray Bear smiled. "He declared you to be under the protection of his family. But more than that, he said you showed the kind of honor that transcends the boundaries between peoples. This is not something said lightly." As the warriors began preparing to leave, Jake noticed something that would puzzle him for days to come. Several of the younger men were taking careful note of his property. They studied the layout of his buildings, the condition of his fences, the location of his water source. At first, Jake wondered if they were planning some kind of future attack. But their manner was too respectful, too protective. Running Wolf noticed Jake's confusion and explained, "We are learning your land so we can better protect it. My grandfather's word is law among our people. If he says you are to be protected, then protected you will be." Within a week of the warriors' departure, Jake began to notice changes around his ranch. Small signs at first. His cattle, which had always been nervous about predators, seemed calmer. The wolves that usually howled from the nearby hills had gone quiet. Most remarkably, Jake found that various problems around his property were mysteriously solving themselves. A section of fence that had been damaged by the storm was repaired with expert craftsmanship using materials Jake had never seen before. His water trough, which had been cracked and leaking, was somehow fixed overnight. When Jake examined the repair work, he found it was better than anything he could have done himself. But the most dramatic change came when Jake's nearest neighbor, Tom Bradley, rode over in a panic one morning. "Jake," Tom called out as he approached. "The cabin. You need to pack up and get out of here right now." Jake stepped outside, coffee cup in hand. "What's the problem, Tom?" "The Garrett gang is headed this way. They hit the Mackenzie place yesterday, took all their livestock and burned down their barn. Word is they're moving through the territory taking what they want from anyone who can't." "Stop them." Jake had heard of the Garrett gang. They were a group of outlaws who preyed on isolated homesteads, stealing cattle and horses before disappearing into the wilderness. They were known for their brutality and their ability to stay one step ahead of the law. "How many of them?" Jake asked. "At least a dozen, maybe more." "Jake, these aren't ordinary rustlers, they're killers. They won't just take your cattle and leave. You need to get to town until the law can deal with them." Jake looked around his property, thinking of all the work he'd put into building his life here. The idea of running away didn't sit well with him, but he also wasn't stupid enough to think he could fight off a dozen armed outlaws by himself. "I appreciate the warning, Tom, but this is my home. I'm not running." Tom stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Jake, you can't fight them alone. They'll kill you and take everything anyway." Before Jake could respond, both men heard something that made them freeze. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats approaching fast from the north. Tom went pale and reached for his rifle. "That's them," Tom whispered. "We're too late." But as the riders came into view, Jake realized these weren't outlaws. The men approaching were Native American warriors, and they were moving with the disciplined precision of a military unit. At their head rode Running Wolf, his face grim with purpose. The warriors surrounded Jake's property in a matter of minutes, positioning themselves with strategic skill that made it clear they were experienced fighters. Running Wolf rode up to where Jake and Tom stood, both men still stunned by the sudden appearance of what looked like a war party. "Jake Morrison," Running Wolf said formally. "We bring word that enemies approach your land. Men who steal and kill. They will be here before the sun reaches its highest point." Tom found his voice first. "How do you know about the Garrett gang?" Running Wolf's expression didn't change. "We watch over our friends' land. We see all who come and go. These outlaws have been tracked since they left the Mackenzie place." Jake felt a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "You've been watching my property? White Eagle's word is sacred. You are under our protection. When threats come against you, they come against us." The next few hours passed like something out of a dream. The warriors positioned themselves around Jake's ranch with military precision. Some took positions in the trees and rock formations around the property. Others hid near the buildings themselves. All of them seemed to disappear into the landscape as if by magic. Jake found himself armed with a rifle he barely knew how to use, crouched behind his own water trough alongside two tribal warriors who spoke no English but communicated everything they needed to with hand gestures and meaningful looks. Tom had opted to take shelter in Jake's cabin, muttering prayers and wondering aloud how his simple warning visit had turned into preparation for a battle. The Garrett gang arrived just after noon, exactly as Running Wolf had predicted. There were 15 of them, hard-looking men with the casual arrogance of people who were used to taking whatever they wanted. They rode into Jake's yard like they owned the place, their leader already eyeing the cattle in the nearby pasture. "Hello." "The house," the gang leader called out. He was a big man with a thick beard and cold eyes. "We're just passing through and need some supplies. Come on out and we can discuss terms." Jake knew enough about outlaws to understand that discussing terms meant handing over everything of value and hoping they didn't burn down his buildings for fun. He also knew that the traditional response of coming out with his hands up would likely end with him face down in the snow dot instead. Jake stayed hidden and watched as the gang spread out around his property, clearly planning to surround the cabin and force him out. What they didn't realize was that they were walking into a trap prepared by some of the finest warriors in the Dakota Territory. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of the outlaws simply disappeared. One moment he was riding toward the barn. The next moment, his horse was wandering riderless, while the man himself was nowhere to be seen. "Billy?" the gang leader called out. "Where'd Billy go?" Before anyone could answer, two more outlaws vanished, as silently as the first. Now the gang was getting nervous, looking around wildly and drawing their weapons. "It's an ambush!" Someone shouted, but by then it was too late. The warriors emerged from their hiding places like spirits materializing from the landscape itself. The outlaws found themselves surrounded by men who moved with deadly silence and fought with weapons they barely understood. The battle, if it could even be called that, was over in minutes. The Garrett gang, which had terrorized homesteaders across the territory for months, was captured almost without a shot being fired. The warriors had used tactics and terrain knowledge that made the outlaws look like children playing at war. Jake emerged from behind his water trough to find the gang members tied up and sitting in his yard under guard. Not one of the warriors had been seriously injured, while several of the outlaws were nursing wounds that would remind them of this day for the rest of their lives. Running, Wolf approached Jake with what might have been a smile. "Your land is safe, Jake Morrison. These men will trouble no one again." Tom Bradley stumbled out of the cabin looking like a man who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. He stared at the captured outlaws, then at the warriors, then at Jake. "I don't understand what just happened here," Tom said quietly. Jake put his hand on his neighbor's shoulder. "I think what happened is that I learned what it means to have real friends." As word of the battle spread throughout the territory, Jake discovered that his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The story of how tribal warriors had protected a white settler from outlaws became legend almost overnight. Other homesteaders who had previously avoided Jake's isolated ranch now sought him out for advice on how to establish peaceful relations with the local tribes. More importantly, the boundaries between two worlds had begun to blur in ways that benefited everyone. The warriors had demonstrated that they could be powerful allies rather than feared enemies. The settlers had learned that respect and kindness could build bridges that bullets and the months that followed the capture of the Garrett gang brought changes to Jake's life that he never could have imagined. His small ranch, once isolated on the edge of civilization, had become something entirely unexpected. People called it a meeting ground, a place where two worlds came together in peace. It started small. A few neighboring ranchers would stop by to ask Jake's advice about dealing with tribal hunting parties that crossed their land. Instead of reaching for their guns, they wanted to know how to show respect. Jake found himself teaching white settlers about customs he was still learning himself, sharing the wisdom that White Eagle had passed on to him during their long conversations. The old medicine man had become a regular visitor to Jake's ranch. Sometimes he came alone, riding his spotted horse across the prairie to sit by Jake's fire and share stories. Other times he brought family members, including Running Wolf and some of the younger warriors who were curious about this white man their grandfather had claimed as friend. These visits weren't just social calls. White Eagle was teaching Jake things that no book or school could have shown him. How to read the sky for weather changes days in advance, which plants could heal sickness and which ones were dangerous. How to track animals by signs so subtle that most people would never notice them. In return, Jake shared his knowledge of farming and ranching. He showed White Eagle how to preserve meat using salt and smoke, techniques that could help the tribes survive harsh winters. He demonstrated how to build structures that could withstand prairie storms, and how to dig wells that would provide clean water year-round. One autumn afternoon, as Jake and White Eagle sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset, the old man said something that would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. "You know, my friend, what you did that night in the storm was not really about saving one old man from freezing." Jake looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" White Eagle smiled with the wisdom of someone who had seen many seasons come and go. "You chose to see a human being in need instead of an enemy to fear. That choice opened a door that had been closed for many years. Now others can walk through that door because you showed them it was safe." As if to prove White Eagle's point, Jake's ranch began attracting visitors from both communities. Tribal members would stop by to trade goods or share information about game movements and weather patterns. White settlers would come seeking advice about everything from crop rotation to dealing with difficult neighbors. The most remarkable development came when disputes arose between the two groups. Instead of escalating into violence, both sides began bringing their problems to Jake's ranch. His property had somehow become neutral ground where grievances could be aired and solutions found. Jake wasn't a judge or a lawman, but he had something more valuable. He had the trust of both communities. When a tribal hunting party accidentally damaged a settler's fence, they came to Jake to help make things right. When white ranchers' cattle wandered onto traditional hunting grounds, Jake helped negotiate. Compensation that satisfied everyone. The arrangement worked because Jake never tried to impose solutions. Instead, he provided a safe space where people could talk honestly about their concerns. White Eagle often helped with these discussions, his presence lending authority and wisdom to the proceedings. One spring morning, Jake woke to find his property bustling with activity. Dozens of people, both tribal members and settlers, were working together on some kind of construction project. When Jake stumbled outside with his coffee, still trying to understand what was happening, Running Wolf approached with a grin. "Surprise, my friend. Today we build you a proper meeting hall." Jake watched in amazement as the two communities worked side by side. White settlers who had never spoken to a tribal member before were sharing tools and laughing with warriors who had once viewed all white men as enemies. Women from both groups prepared food together, their children playing games that mixed traditions from both cultures. The building that rose that day was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It combined the log construction techniques of the settlers with the design wisdom of the tribes. The result was a structure that felt welcoming to both communities, a physical symbol of the cooperation that had grown from one cold night and one act of kindness. But not everyone was happy about the changes taking place. Some settlers viewed Jake's friendship with the tribes as dangerous or even treasonous. A few tribal members thought their people were becoming too trusting of white settlers who might betray them later. The criticism reached a peak when a group of men from the nearest town rode out to Jake's ranch one day. Their leader was a man named Fletcher, who owned the largest general store in town and had strong opinions about how the territory should be managed. "Morrison," Fletcher called out as he and his men dismounted, "we need to talk." Jake stepped out of his cabin, noting that several of Fletcher's companions had their hands near their weapons. This wasn't a friendly visit. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Jake asked calmly. Fletcher got straight to the point. "This situation you've created here is dangerous. You're encouraging these people to think they can just wander freely through settled territory. It's going to lead to trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked. "The kind that ends with someone getting killed," Fletcher replied. "You're playing with fire, Morrison? These people aren't your friends. They're just waiting for the right moment to turn on you." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Running Wolf and a dozen warriors rode into view, their timing so perfect it seemed planned. They positioned themselves around Jake's property with the casual precision that had become their trademark. Fletcher and his men suddenly looked much less confident. Their hands moved away from their weapons and their aggressive postures softened considerably. "You were saying something about trouble, Fletcher?" Jake asked mildly. The store owner's face reddened, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. "This isn't over, Morrison. Mark my words, this friendship of yours is going to end badly." As Fletcher and his men rode away, Running Wolf approached Jake with concern in his eyes. "These men speak for many in your towns?" he asked. Jake sighed. "Some of them, yes. Change is never easy for people. They're afraid of what they don't understand." "Fear makes people do foolish things," Running Wolf observed. Despite the opposition from some quarters, the partnership between Jake's ranch and the tribal communities continued to grow stronger. The meeting hall became a regular gathering place where people from both cultures shared knowledge. settled disputes, and built relationships that transcended old prejudices. Years passed, and Jake's hair began to show gray at the temples, white. Eagle, now well into his 70s, still made regular visits to the ranch, though he moved more slowly than he once had. The old medicine man had become something of a grandfather figure to Jake, filling a role that had been empty since Jake's own grandfather died many years before. One winter evening, as they sat by the fire in Jake's cabin, White Eagle said something that surprised his friend. "I will not see many more winters, Jake Morrison. My body grows weak and my spirit calls me toward the next world." Jake felt a pain in his chest at these words. "Don't talk like that, old friend. You've got plenty of good years left." White Eagle smiled gently. "Death is not something to fear when a man has lived a full life. I have seen my grandchildren grow strong and wise. I have helped my people navigate difficult times. Most importantly, I have seen enemies become friends through the power of simple human kindness." The old man reached into his traveling bag and pulled out something wrapped in soft leather. "I want you to have this." Jake unwrapped the gift to find a beautifully crafted pipe, its stem decorated with intricate beadwork and carved symbols. "This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him. It is passed down to those who understand the sacred nature of bringing people together in peace." Jake held the pipe reverently, understanding the honor he was being given. "I don't know what to say. Say nothing. Just promise me that you will continue to tend the fire you started that night. Keep it burning so that others can find warmth and light." White Eagle died peacefully 2 months later, surrounded by his family. At his funeral, Jake was one of only 3 white men invited to attend the sacred ceremonies. As he watched the traditional rites that honored a life well lived, Jake realized how profoundly that one stormy night had changed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. The legacy of that night continued long after both men were gone. Jake's ranch remained a meeting place for generations, a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. Local historians would later write that the alliance forged between Jake Morrison and White Eagle had prevented decades of conflict and bloodshed in the Dakota Territory, but for Jake, the most important legacy was simpler and more personal. In saving one old man from freezing, he had discovered something precious about the human capacity for kindness. He had learned that the fire of compassion, once lit, could warm not just 2 people on a cold night, but entire communities for generations to come.